Today we're going to be looking at another domain of development, particularly cognitive development. So when we're talking about cognitive development, we're talking about the growth and maturing of thinking processes. So the development of knowledge and skills, problem-solving abilities, just basically anything that has to do with thinking, the development of the ability to think. So we're looking at child and adolescent development. So we're going to again touch a little bit on some other ages and stages, but mainly we're going to focus on cognitive development in school-aged children, since that's the focus of our course. So we're actually going to spend 2 sessions looking at cognitive development because it's a big topic and of course has a lot of importance when we're looking at a school setting or an educational setting. So for this session, we're going to be looking at some of the major theories of cognitive development, and then later we'll be looking at some specific areas of cognitive development. So for today, we basically have three main theories that we're going to be looking at. So first of all, we're looking at Piaget, who was one of the most well-known theorists about cognitive development, and then Vygotsky. And then third, we're going to look at another type of theory that's information processing theory. So those are kind of the 3 categories that we're going to be focusing on today. Piaget is probably the most well-known cognitive psychologist. And he was actually a Swiss psychologist, and he was doing his work in the early 1900s. And he came up with a theory of learning that is a constructivist theory. So let's just talk real quick about what constructivist means. So a constructivist theory means that when people learn, or when students learn, they're not just learning just by absorbing new things. They're not just like an empty vessel that's being filled up with knowledge. That's kind of a traditional view of learning, is that you're being filled with knowledge. It's passive, right? You're absorbing things. But a constructivist viewpoint gives the theory that it's not passive, that you take in stimuli or information or experiences, but then you construct meaning from those experiences. So you are an active part of the learning process. It's not passive. So this is definitely a constructivist theory. So some main principles of Piaget's theory of cognitive development are that, first of all, children are naturally curious about the world. Children are naturally prone to learn and explore and make meaning from their experiences. That's a normal instinctual thing. Then second, mental exploration drives cognitive growth. So exploring things, trying things, being exposed to new things is what drives cognitive growth, the act of exploring. And finally, children organize their learning into schemas, and we're going to talk more about that in just a second here about what that means. So one of Piaget's key principles is that children organize information, or people organize information into schemas. So what's a schema? A schema is sort of like categories that we create with the information that we have stored in our brain. So information is not stored in our brain just randomly. It's not just stored sequentially based on when we learn it, but we sort it into categories, right? And it's based on the background knowledge we have and the prior experiences that we have for different topics and ideas. So we have schemas for basically everything we know, where we've kind of organized information that goes together. So for example, let's think about children. Children have to develop a schema for what a snake is. So their schema about a snake, as maybe someone reads them a story about a snake, maybe they see a picture of a snake, maybe they see a snake outside and someone tells them, well, that's a snake. And so through their experiences, they're building their knowledge of what a snake is. And so their schema for a snake may be that, oh, snakes are wiggly, snakes are long, snakes don't have any legs, snakes have kind of scaly skin. And so that's their schema for snake. When they hear about a snake, that's what they think of. They might have a schema for horses. Horses are kind of tall, bigger than they are. Horses have tails. Horses have manes. That's the schema of what they know about a horse. It can also be more complicated. So you could have a schema about events. Sometimes these are called then scripts instead of schemas, but it's the same idea. So children develop a schema about what's a birthday party. Oh, well, at a birthday party, there's usually cake and presents, and there's friends, and you sing the birthday song. Maybe you get to take home a birthday favor. You're supposed to say thank you when you leave. They as they get older, they put together more information about what a birthday party is. We have as adults have schemas. So, we have a schema. If someone says to you, I'm going to the office, you have a schema about what an office is, right? Probably has a computer. Probably there's a chair in there. There's probably walls of some kind, or maybe cubicle walls, and people work in an office. And, you know that there's different kinds of offices, and large, small, windows, no windows, but you have a basic idea. If someone says office, you have a schema or a group of information that you know what an office is. So Piaget is just saying this is how people think, which is, that's true. If we think about it, we probably do think that way. So how do we learn new information then? Well, Piaget talks about two ways, and that's assimilation and accommodation. So when new information comes in, when you see something new, when you have a new experience, the new information that's coming in, you have to stop and think, how does this fit with the schema that I already have? Okay. Is it consistent or not consistent? So a child has a schema in their head about a snake, like we just talked about. Well, their schema says, yeah, they're long, wiggly, scales, no legs. That's a snake. I know what a snake is. But then they're at the zoo, and they see something that's long and wiggly and has scales, but it has legs. So it doesn't fit with their schema of a snake. So now they've got to figure out, okay, is what I'm seeing, is that consistent with what I know in my schema? And if it is, if they see something that is, long and wiggly with scales and has no legs, and like, oh, that fits with what I know. It's a snake. That's also a snake. That's called assimilation. If they see something that doesn't fit, oh, that looks like a snake, but it has legs. It's not a snake. That's called accommodation. And so when you have accommodation where the new information doesn't fit with your existing schema, then you have to change your schema, right? Because now it's like, oh, well, does that mean that some snakes have legs? Or maybe there's other things that have scales and are wiggly, but that do have legs, like it's a salamander or it's a lizard or, whatever. But you have to, assimilate it. Same thing, we talked about the horse's schema. Well, now I see something that looks like a horse, but it has a big horn on its head. It's in a book, and wait, that's not a horse, but it's kind of like a horse. Oh, it's a unicorn. So, so you have to have accommodation you have to change your schema to fit with the new information that you have. So here's another example. So you see this four-legged animal, right? And someone tells you, oh, that's a dog. That's a dog. And so you have a schema that four-legged animals that are pets that live in people's houses, they're dogs. So when you see this animal, you're like, yep, that's a dog. It's a four-legged pet. It's a dog. It fits with what I already know. That's assimilation. But let's say I have an existing schema about the dog, and then I see a pet that has four legs. I'm like, oh, dog. And mom tells me, no, that's a cat. So now I have to change my schema that, oh, not all four-legged animals are dogs. Some of them are cats. Now that's accommodation. I've had to change my schema. I've learned something, right? So when the new information that you have fits with your schema, it works. You don't have to change anything. We call that equilibrium. When the new information that's just come in doesn't fit with your schema, ooh, I have to change it. That's called disequilibrium. And so learning is when you go back and forth between equilibrium and disequilibrium. And that's called equilibration. And that's where learning takes place. So, you have to encounter new information that doesn't fit with what you used to think in order to learn. That's very important. So here's just another example. So, a child has a theory, a schema that, oh, this is a cat. and everything they see fits it, right? And in their mind, cats are orange and fluffy and have a tail, right? Oh, the other's still kind of orange, it's fluffy, it has a tail. Yep, that's still a cat. But then they see this thing, something happens that doesn't make sense. Oh, wait, it looks like a cat and it sounds like a cat, but it's not orange. That's disequilibrium. So now they have to have accommodation and they have to realize, oh, cats can be all different colors. And so now they've had that learning take place. So this is the Piaget's theory of learning with schemas. Okay, as we go on and continue to talk about Piaget's theories of learning, he also talks about learning happening in 4 stages. So we start with sensorimotor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And you can see on this chart, we have, the early stage, the order that they go in, but it's not like you do one and then you stop and go to the next and then stop. You're still, you still got skills from some characteristics of the previous stage as you go on to the next stage. So it's kind of a gradual thing. So we're going to talk about what these different stages of thinking, these stages of cognitive development look like. Another thing they developed in this stage is the understanding of cause and effect. So you've seen babies that learn that if I push this toy, it's going to fall off the edge of the high chair, right? And that's very entertaining to them. Well, that's a new skill because infants, when they're first born, don't have that understanding. If I push this, something's going to happen. During this period, they develop that understanding. And this is also when babies will begin to develop symbolic thinking. So as they go through the stage, you'll see older babies start to do things like, rock a doll like it's a baby, or, pick up a block or something and talk on it like it's a phone, because they're starting to understand, pretend and symbolic thinking. So a lot of changes that take place during this stage. During the pre-operational stage, this is ages about 2 to 5, so we're talking kind of the preschool years. And this is where kids really develop into that pretend play thinking, where they can really imagine something. It's not just about what's in front of them necessarily, but they can imagine, they can pretend. But their thinking in these stages tends to really go into opposites. They're not thinking about like really nuanced things. It's, there's mom and dad, there's a hero and a villain. There's not a lot of gray areas. It's very black and white to them. And kind of what you see is what you get. They're not good at subtlety, at understanding subtlety. It's just, I see people in cowboy hats with horses, and so they're cowboys, and that's it. It's what you see is what you get. This is also the age where egocentrism is pretty much the stage that they are at in their thinking. And that's where they really cannot take the perspective of another person or understand that another person may have a different perspective than they do. To them, their perspective is the only perspective. And it's not necessarily that kids at this age are being selfish when they do that. That's literally the stage that their thinking is at. So I want to show you an example. This is a really famous experiment called the 3 mountain task. So this is something Piaget did. And he would sit, an adult on one side of the table and the child on the other side of the table and put 3 mountains in between, like with different, and there were different like little things on the mountain. So things that you could only see from one side, right? And he would ask the child to describe, well, what do you see? And the child would describe what they see. They can do that. That's their cognitive development. They see it, they can tell you what it is. So they say, oh, I see this, I see this, I see this. But then you'd say, what do I see from my side of the table? Do I see that same thing you're seeing? And they cannot. They will describe again what they see, even if you have them switch places. And then you're like, now tell me what I see from over here. They can't describe it because to them, whatever they see is what everybody sees. And so you can see how that would have a lot of implications for teaching kids this age, because it's really, really difficult for them to understand that, someone else has a different opinion than they do, or a different needs or wants than they do, or that they've hurt someone's feelings or things like that, because it's really hard for them to understand someone else's perspective. The next stage is concrete operational. So this is where students are, or children are beginning to really understand logic, and but that is limited to really concrete real life situations. So they're not really able to think about abstract things, but they can think logically about things that are very concrete and real life. They can start to take someone else's perspective. This is where they learn to develop that. And this is where they learn that things can belong to more than one category. So up till now, it might be, if you give them a box of buttons, and the buttons are, some of them are, they're all wooden, and some are red and some are blue. You might say, well, how many blue buttons are there? And they could tell you. And they could say, well, how many red buttons are there? But then when you say how many wooden buttons, they don't understand that it could be wooden and blue or wooden and red. But here, they're beginning to understand that. They also develop the concept of conservation. That's a big part, big thing that students develop at this age, and that's one of the ways that you can tell if they are in this stage is if they've developed that concept. So let me explain what the concept of conservation is. So if you look at these two glasses of water here, A and B, right? You're in, if I asked you, do they have the same amount of water in them? You'd be like, yeah, they do, right? If you poured this glass B into this glass C that's a different shape, and you said, okay, now do A and C have the same amount of water in them? You, as an adult, would say, well, of course they do. It did before when it was in the other glass. It still does when it's in this glass. It's just the shape of the glass is different. It's the same amount of water. But a child that has not developed the concept of conservation absolutely would not understand that. They would say, oh, no, C has less because it's smaller. Right? They would not understand that even just because something changes the shape, the amount doesn't change. Same thing with weights. So like here, if A and B, these lumps of clay, if they weighed the same amount, then if you squish one and flatten it into a different shape, obviously they would still weigh the same amount, right? The weight hasn't changed. But a child that hasn't developed the concept of conservation would say, no, that one's lighter, right? Because they don't understand that the weight didn't change when the shape changed. So understanding this concept that things are consistent regardless of their shape is something that happens during this stage of development. Finally, we get into the formal operational stage, and this is the highest level, and this is 12 and up. So some students don't develop this till much later. 12 is about the earliest you might see this start to develop, but this is where students begin to develop abstract thinking and really advanced reasoning, and they can understand something that's not real life, something that's a hypothetical situation, and this is where you see a lot of like idealism coming from students, like they become very idealistic, or well, this is the way it should be, because they're able to really kind of understand theoretical things and like what would be the perfect way for things to be in a perfect world. So what kind of educational implications does this have for us with these different stages of learning? Well, it's really important that we as educators think about what stage our kids are at. Because if you're trying to teach something very abstract, like say in math is a good example here. If you're trying to teach like the concept of infinity or negative numbers, which like you can't count negative things, like that's a very abstract concept. If you're trying to teach that to an 8-year-old, they're not going to get it. And it's not because they're not trying to learn or they're not smart. It's that their brain has not developed to a stage where it can understand abstract, right? So if you're teaching kids that are still in those younger stages, you need to keep things concrete, hands-on. When you're teaching math, have actual objects for them to do. Don't try to expect them to understand things that are abstract. But if you're teaching older students, you can help them with those concepts. Another important takeaway here is that play is really important. So you can see from Piaget's theories that by experimenting with things is how you learn, and it's how you develop your schemas. It's how you assimilate new information, right? So it's very important in early and middle childhood that play is part of learning. And then it's important to activate prior knowledge. So, if you're introducing something new to children, help them, like kind of activate the schema that they already have in their brain. So, hey, today we're going to be reading about salamanders. Hey, you already know about some other kinds of amphibians. You know about frogs and you know about snakes, and these are kind of similar, but there's some differences that we're going to talk about. So you're activating what they already know, so they have their schema ready to go and they can take that new information in. Create disequilibrium on purpose. So it's important to create situations, as you saw, learning takes place when you're in disequilibrium, when new information is coming in and it doesn't match what you already know and you have to try to decide what to do with it. So create that on purpose. Create situations where children are exposed to ideas and things that they didn't expect. This is where, like in science, for example, you do an experiment and you show them something like, oh, what do you think is going to happen with this science experiment? And then something different actually happens, right? And it's like, I wonder why. We've got to figure it out. So creating that disequilibrium and indulging their curiosity. Children are naturally curious. So using questioning strategies. Why do you think this is happening? What do you know about this already? How does this fit with what you already know? Those are really great ways to facilitate learning. The next theorist that we're going to talk about is Vygotsky. So Vygotsky was a Russian scientist, and he's around kind of the same time as Piaget, early 1900s. And he also had a constructivist theory of learning, where we're talking about, making meaning, not just being an empty vessel for learning. But what makes Vygotsky's theory a little bit different is that there's more emphasis on guidance from others. So in Piaget's theory, a lot of it was, about discovering things and making meaning, for yourself within your schema and things. But with Vygotsky's theory, learning is really culturally dependent. So it's dependent on your culture, it's dependent on others around you. And so there's more of an emphasis on the guidance that you get from skilled others, from teachers, from parents, to help you develop cognitively. And one important piece of this is mediation. So that's the practice by which educators help children make sense of their experiences. So it's not just about the experiences and the children making sense of them themselves. It's about us helping the children make sense of their experiences. And that can be done both informally, through conversations, or also through formal teaching. So let's go into Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of cognitive development. So some of the key concepts that he has. First of all, Vygotsky talks a lot about self-regulation. So this is where students or children are learning to kind of process what they're experiencing. And so students start out with self-talk, which is where, you've probably seen kids do this, literally speak out loud. Oh, first I do this, or look at this rock. It's shiny. I wonder, and they're talking out loud, self-talk, like talking themselves through what they're doing. Now, over time, as learning matures, as cognitive development matures, that changes into inner speech, where we're still like talking ourselves through what we're doing, but we do it internally instead of doing it out loud necessarily. So that's one of the key points. And another key point for Vygotsky is the zone of proximal development. We're gonna get into that and talk about that in just a minute here. So, all right, the zone of proximal development. The idea here is, when you think about learning, that you have things that a child can do by themselves. They can do it on their own without any help. They're capable independently. And then you have things that they can't do, like even with help. It's outside of their realm of ability at that point, right? And in between is the perfect place for them to be. Because if they stay in the place where they can do everything by themselves, it's easy, they don't need any help. If they stay in that place, which is like their comfort zone, they're not growing, right? There's no growth happening. If they're in this space where even with help, there's no way, it's beyond their ability, they cannot do it, well, that's just going to lead to frustration and they're going to give up, right? But that in-between area is the zone of proximal development, which is where they can do it if they have a little bit of help. That's where we want to aim our instruction, is in the zone of proximal development. So, and that's where growth is going to happen. This is a really key concept in education. So what we do as educators is we provide what's called scaffolding. And so scaffolding is support that you give students to enable them to be in the zone of proximal development, right? Because if they're in the center, they don't need any support. If they're out here, then there's no amount of support we can give them that can help them. But in the zone of proximal development, we give them scaffolding. So we give them just enough support that they can do it. Okay. And then as they get better and better at whatever skill we're teaching, we gradually take the support away. So this is where in teaching, we want to have guided participation. So for example, if you're trying to teach cooking skills, you're going to teach it very differently with a toddler than a teenager, right? Because their zone of proximal development is different. So they need different kinds of scaffolding. If you're teaching a toddler how to cook, you are going to be doing a lot of it, but you're going to be saying, okay, here's the dough, here's the rolling pin, let me put my hands on top of your hands and let's roll it together, right? Or, here's the flour, okay, now really carefully pour it in, now let's take the spoon and I'm going to put my hand with yours and we're going to stir it really carefully, right? You're going to give them a lot of scaffolding. If you're teaching a teenager to cook, you're not going to do that. You're going to say, okay, here's the recipe. Go ahead and read it. And, do you know what it means when it says to saute? You don't? Oh, well, saute means that you put in a little butter and turn it on low heat. Go ahead and try that and I'll watch you do it. And you're giving them a different kind of scaffolding, right? That's appropriate for their zone of proximal development. So the idea of scaffolding is that we as educators are giving appropriate support that enables them to be independent. Now, it's important, though, to realize that that scaffolding eventually needs to be removed. We don't leave the scaffolding there forever, right? The idea is that as they get better and better, you take it away. So how can we do that practically in the classroom? We can do things like divide a task into smaller steps. We can do things like give them tools. Give them, if you want them to eventually learn how to take notes, you give them maybe a guided notes thing where they fill in the blanks to start, and then you start having more blanks, and then pretty soon they're doing it themselves. This is also called the gradual release of responsibility model, where you do it, you show them how to do it, and then you do it with them, and then eventually they do it by themselves. That's gradual release of responsibility that is totally based on Vygotsky's theory of the zone of proximate development. So things like apprenticeships work well with this. When you have student-run activities, like if you're going to have a student club and you're going to have the students run it themselves, that all has to do with this sociocultural theory of learning. So how do we use this for education? Well, we talked about how Vygotsky says that students use self-talk, right? So we should model that. We should talk them through. If I'm solving a problem up on the board, I should talk it through. My self-talk is probably internal, right? Because I'm an adult, but I should model it out loud so that they can learn how to do it. So I say, I'm looking at this problem, and the first thing I wonder is that number bigger than that number? Oh, it is. So I need to start with that number. Anyways, whatever it is, you model the self-talk. And then differentiation. So we need to adapt our instruction to meet the student's needs. We need to find a level that's just right. It's like Goldilocks, right? Not too hot, not too cold, just right. We need to find something that's not too hard and not too easy. Sometimes we're tempted to give things that are too easy to kids, but that is not helpful. They may be successful, but they're not growing. So we've got to find that zone of proximal development where they're able to learn. The last theory I want to talk about is not associated with a specific person like the other two, but this is information processing theory. So this is different than the other two are constructivist theories, which are about like how we make meaning. This is different. In this theory, the idea is the brain is like a computer. And so we have different steps that we used for our brain to encode, to store. We call it encoding, storage, and rehearsal. So encoding is where we input the information into our memory system, into our brain, right? Then the storage is retaining the information in our brain. And then the retrieval or rehearsal and retrieval is using the information. So we talk about different types of memory in this theory, in this model. We have sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Okay. Short-term memory is also called working memory. So how it works is basically the information comes into our sensory memory to start. And in the sensory memory, our sensory memory lasts like 1 to 2 seconds. So it's very brief. This is basically just perceiving something. Like we see something, we hear something. It comes into our senses, and it's real quick. We perceive it, and either we ignore it and discard it, or we move it to our short-term or working memory. Okay. Most things we just ignore. If you think about all the sensory input that you have in a day, everything that you see, hear, we ignore most of it. We would go crazy if we didn't, right? We would be completely overwhelmed. But what moves something from the sensory memory into the short-term working memory is attention. If we pay attention to it, then it gets moved into the short-term memory or the working memory. Okay, so if we don't pay attention to it, it's gone. If we pay attention to it, then instead of just lasting 1 second, then it moves into short-term memory or working memory. Okay, in short-term working memory, things can stay there for about 20 seconds, and we can store about 7 pieces of information at once. That's about the capacity of our working memory. And so things that we've paid attention to go into the working memory, and then it's a matter of if we put it into our long-term memory, we keep it. Okay. If we don't, it's gone. So how do we get things to go into that long-term memory? Okay. Well, it's basically rehearsal. Now, in theory, there is no limit to our long-term memory. We can store limited information in long-term memory. Now, it is true, though, that some information is going to be lost over time. Things don't necessarily last forever in the long-term memory, but they haven't found any limit on what can be put into long-term memory. Here's the key, though. In order for things to move into the long-term memory and stay there, you have to do something with it. So you have to process the information, manipulate the information, rehearse the information, do something with it in order to keep it. So what does that mean for education? Well, it's a fact that we typically tend to forget 80% of what was presented to us in a class by 1 day later. Same thing with what we read. We read something and we typically have forgotten 80% of it 1 day later. So it's not, we may have paid attention, but it's not being moved into our long-term memory, right? Or at least if it is moved into long-term memory, it doesn't stick there. So how do we get it to stick? Well, we need to manipulate or process the information, not just read and listen to it. So we need to teach students how to do that. A lot of times students think studying is just, okay, you have to study for this subject. Well, they think that just means you just reread the chapter, or you just, listen to the lecture or whatever. It's more than that. You have to do something with what you're hearing or reading. So just the act of, creating flashcards, quizzing yourself, taking what you just read and saying, can I summarize that in my own words? Any kind of manipulating of the information is going to help move that information into your long-term memory. So we need to teach students how to do that, how to, I just read a paragraph. I'm going to stop. What did I just read? Does that make sense to me? Do I have questions about it? Can I say it in my own words? That's what's going to help things move into their long-term memory. So in the information processing theory perspective, how does our memory develop? Well, We start out with that sensory register, right? Where we perceive things as they come at us, as we experience them. But then over time, we develop the short-term and long-term memory as our attention develops, as we're able to pay attention to more and more things. Then throughout childhood and adolescence, we develop something called executive functioning. Executive functioning is like the ability of the brain um, to organize what the stimuli that are coming in. And so executive functioning is your ability to do things like plan ahead, to do things like pay attention when you don't want to pay attention, to sustain your attention even when you're distracted by something, to disregard irrelevant stimuli. So ignore, if you're trying to read and something else is going on up here, you're able to ignore it. That's executive functioning skill. So those are things that develop throughout childhood and adolescence, and we want to help children develop that executive functioning. So how can we help them develop executive functioning? We can help them develop their attention skills. So, if we're reading a chapter, if we're presenting a lecture, we can highlight important information, say, okay, now do you think this is important? Let's take a look at this. This is something, and when I say highlight important information, literally highlight it, like with highlighter, or just draw their attention to it. But teach them how to discern what's important and not important. Help them learn to direct their attention, and also provide a variety of sensory experiences for young children. And watch out for perceptual delays. We talked about how so much of what we learn, first it comes into that sensory memory, right? Which is, the things we see and hear. If a child has some kind of delay in seeing or hearing or other sensory things, then that's going to have a big effect on their learning and their memory development. So watch for that, and see how you can help children early on to be able to develop these working memory systems.